for my presentation today is this here. The fact that there are certain necessary conditions of bureaucratization. And in that sense, I go back, as I do, of course, with my work on bureaucracy, to the work of the sociologist Max Weber, who already argued that a modicum of peace, of tranquility relative to other societies is a necessary condition for the police function to professionalize. So let's say a society that is engaged in external conflict doesn't have the luxury, so to speak, to focus a lot of attention on internal conflict. Conversely, a society that is relatively at peace with its neighboring state can focus on these internal elements, if you will. So pacification is an important concern. Also an important concern to account for differences in police institutions across the world is the relative extent to which a society is democratically organized. And actually, we will see there are many examples of that, because obviously societies that are not at peace and not democratic are going to have quite different police response to terrorism. Now, I should say that the paper that you've gotten by email, I'm sure that all of you have read very thoroughly, is largely derived from chapter 6 of my book, and I would obviously have to revise it more for this paper to be a self-standing paper. And what I want you to know is this: I give a brief overview here of the totality of my book. This paper makes sense relative to the background of this book. And in the book, I first of all talk substantially for several chapters about counterterrorism policing in the United States. So that is the background of this particular chapter. Furthermore, in the book, I have a separate, an entirely separate chapter on Israel, which is not present in this paper, which is kind of an obvious omission, but I have an entirely separate paper on that, which actually largely goes back to an ethnographic research that I did in Israel while I visited Israel, and I've experienced, let's say I have done research, particularly in terms of undercover counterterrorism policing. I also have a separate chapter on Iraq and Afghanistan, where obviously, the war on terror and the police function are very, very differently organized. And like I said before, I have separate chapters specifically on Interpol and Europol. But what I'm giving you is something I haven't presented before and have not written about before. So, I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the nations that I discussed. Right? Obviously, that is the bulk of the paper, and it's rather, empirically dense. So I'm not going to go into each and every detail. You can read that, but I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the nations that I discussed and how the policing of terrorism is situated within those nations, within a broader context of counterterrorism, and also within particular political and legal context. The first case I used is Canada, obviously, the northerly neighbor of the United States. What is remarkable in Canada is, first of all, you see a very distinct impact of 9/11. And in Canada, actually, there are two initiatives, political and legal, that very much mirror the conditions in the United States, namely the fact that Canada passed an anti-terrorism act after 9/11, and that Canada also set up a new department, an executive department, like Homeland Security in the United States, called Public Safety Canada. So both at the policy level and at the legal level, it's almost copying the United States. What is different in Canada is obviously the police system and how policing exists relative to intelligence, because Canada has a domestic intelligence agency, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. So that makes it rather distinct from the United States, where maybe the only comment that can be made in terms of the United States, of course, is that absent a domestic intelligence agency, that it is nonetheless also the case that the FBI has for a long time done both enforcement and intelligence functions, but then within an investigative agency. Other than that, the Canadian situation is relatively similar to the United States, again, in terms of, in this case not a federal, but a national police, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, taking up important counterterrorism functions. Probably the key difference in the Canadian context By now, of course, there are some joint investigative teams set up, particularly at the border regions, but a key difference is the manner in which cooperation is translated in the Canadian context. On the one hand, we have interagency cooperation and a huge emphasis on we have to establish smooth cooperation. That is actually something that runs throughout different countries. But in terms of international cooperation, there is in the Canadian context more of an emphasis and more of a willingness to cooperate even multilaterally, something which in the United States actually is, well, let's say, is prevented if at all possible. Another two countries now in Europe that are interesting make a connection to Canada because they also have domestic intelligence services. So first of all, we have the United Kingdom, where Scotland Yard and MI5 both are heavily involved in counterterrorism. Again, like in Canada, like in the United States, just about any other country, broadening counterterrorism to different institutions means that terrorism is approached within the specific functional domain of those institutions. But it also brings about that there is an increasing need for cooperation. So again, you have coordination efforts taking place in the United Kingdom as well. What is interesting about the United Kingdom furthermore, again, the influence of 9/11, United Kingdom also passed a new Terrorism Act, the Anti-Terrorism Crime and Security Act, which, to some extent you could say, well, the impact of 9/11 is not altogether surprising. Maybe not in Canada, where terrorism was not an issue, but in the United Kingdom, most definitely, because terrorism was a long-standing issue in the United Kingdom because of the Irish issue, the IRA and so on. In France, we have an almost similar situation, I should say a different situation, in the sense that in France, terrorism was not that big of a concern, some in terms of Algerian independence movements in the 60s, but not like a really long-standing concern. Curiously, France did not pass a new law after 9/11, but it did strengthen the existing law, which actually goes back to the 1980s and the 1990s. Again, of course, in France, you have both domestic intelligence agencies as well as national police systems. The difference being, of course, that France has a strongly centralized, truly national police. The Netherlands and Spain are also interesting in terms of contrast. Now again, in terms of, was terrorism already an issue there or not? The Netherlands has made special efforts in terms of coordinating terrorism. The Netherlands was also the first country that had the European anti-terrorism coordinator. It was a Dutch person. But the interesting point about the Netherlands was at least two interesting points. First of all, is the move away from, let's say, I wouldn't say exclusive, but the more or less predominant notion of the policeman as a service person, as the friend and helper. Now it's a more strengthened notion. It's more the police as the enforcement officer because of these terrorism concerns. And second, the interesting thing in the Netherlands is that they've had domestic cases of terrorism after 9/11. The assassination of Fortuyn, and so they had two cases, and that clearly propelled their own involvement, their own, let's say, domestic repercussions of this new wave of global terrorism. Spain, on the other hand, is a very interesting case for two reasons. Because Spain has a long-standing issue with ETA, with the Basque separatist movement, but Spain also had the March 11th event in 2004. There it is very curious that again the impact of 9/11 was greater than the impact of March 11th. So after March 11th, fewer initiatives were taken. Of course, fewer initiatives needed to be taken because they had already taken place since September 11th. And then again we have coordination issues because of the coexistence of various three national police forces. Moving to, let's say, maybe societies that are rather different from the European ones, or to some extent different, is Turkey and then the Arab states. Turkey, obviously, somewhat an in-between context in the sense that we have predominantly Muslim society, but that is very distinctly secular, where again we have long-standing issues on terrorism in terms of the Kurdish separation movement. However, where there are a number of specific characteristics. First of all, we have a rather strongly centralized approach whereby police and military functions more easily coexist as they do in some other states. But